Coming Together, Coming Apart, Episode 12, Ready Player One. In last week's episode, Stalin gave Kim his approval for war against South Korea. Today, we are talking about the preparations for that war and the general state of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea leading directly into the invasion of June 25th, 1950. Last time we were in Korea, I said that Kim's closest advisors were those guerrillas he had fought with in Manchuria. That was only mostly true. He did trust his fellow guerrillas the most, but they would not fill all of the highest offices of the DPRK until the purges of the mid to late 1950s. At this time, in 1950, both the Soviet Koreans and the domestic communists held a decent amount of power and were well situated around Kim's inner circle. They had the experiences Kim needed to run a state bureaucracy and build a party apparatus. As we will see today, though, that fourth faction, the Yonhan faction of Koreans who were close with the Chinese communists, began to fall out of favor. That is because, when Mao gave his approval of Kim's invasion of the Republic of Korea, he did not pledge the full support of the People's Republic of China. From Mao's point of view, that is understandable. The PRC had just emerged from a long war itself and was trying to get on its feet before really committing itself to anything big. Kim viewed that lack of enthusiasm, along with the knowledge that Mao wanted to invade Taiwan, as a threat to his own invasion. So, secrecy was important so as to not give the Chinese the opportunity to undercut the Koreans and provoke an American response in Taiwan before it was acceptable in Korea. In the years between independence and the beginning of the war, the North Korean power structure emanated concentrically from Kim Il-sung. Former guerrillas who fought with Kim were the first layer with a few odd ducks, then Kim's family, then the bulk of the other factions we discussed a few weeks ago, the Soviet Koreans, the Chinese Koreans, and the domestic Koreans. The purposes of this power structure were threefold: to eliminate political dissent through repression and surveillance, to consolidate power by expanding control through North Korean society, and to prepare the country for war through mass mobilization. Each of these are closely connected and done to further each other. But from day one, preparing the country for war against the South was the number one goal. From an American point of view, this would have all been a horrible way to live for North Koreans. The DPRK quickly built a strong police state where most people were surveilled in one way or another and for a multitude of reasons, from questionable relatives to treacherous past actions. That surveillance was intended to align individual thought and action with the revolutionary line of the party. As far as I can tell, at this point in time, the average North Korean had few issues with the police state, mostly because it was better than the Japanese system of just a few years prior. That's an important thing to remember right now. The Japanese colonial system was still the benchmark for most everyone living in Korea. A relative few had strong memories of pre-colonial Korea, but even then, the system of the late 1940s was preferable to the others. One of those factional outliers at the top of the Korean leadership pyramid was Pak Han-yong. Pak was a southern communist we first mentioned back in episode 4, who, by this point, had moved north to escape repression in the south. He was the head of the Korean Communist Party in Seoul and was an active proponent of anti-republican guerrilla activity when he lived in the south. He often exaggerated the amount of support the DPRK had below the 38th parallel, though. We'll see how in the next episode. But, for now, know that Pak declared that 20,000 guerrillas were active in the south, and knew that hundreds of thousands more would rise up as soon as they saw the communists marching their way. Another one of those outliers in the North Korean power structure was Ho Ka-ai. Born in the Soviet Union and known for much of his life as Alexei Ivanovich Hagai, Ho was a Soviet Korean who survived the Stalinist purges of the late 1930s and was an active Communist Party member in Uzbekistan. In 1945, he was recruited by the Red Army to travel to Korea as a Communist Party operative. His main goal was to begin building a Communist Party in the Soviet zone of occupation. By 1946, he was a member of the Central Committee of the North Korean Workers' Party, and, by the time of independence in 1948, he was the third highest-ranking Korean in the DPRK. When the Northern and Southern Workers' Parties merged in 1949, Ho took on the role of First Secretary, responsible for the bureaucratic mundanities of running a political party. From Ho, North Koreans learned the Soviet model for party building. He worked to enroll thousands of Koreans in the party and spread its political message across the rural areas where few formal schools had existed before. He was the exemplar of Soviet political influence in North Korea before the start of the Korean War, and although he was not a conduit of information between Pyongyang and Moscow, he did believe that the Soviets were the principal ally of the young country and promoted the USSR whenever he could. Overall, the actual presence of Soviet nationals in North Korea was thin at best, and concentrated on key crossroads of military, political, and economic power where the few hundred could make the most impact. Even then, Soviet political influence was strongest just before the war. I believe Kim Il-sung genuinely looked up to Stalin and trusted those advisors and representatives the Soviets had placed around him, despite the late entrance of the Soviets into the struggle against the Japanese. Even if Kim did not admire Stalin, everything that he had not learned about leadership during his years as a guerrilla he learned from Stalin. There's a reason Kim would adopt the heavy-handed purges and apotheosis perfected by Stalin. Even today, North Korean leaders are models of Stalinism, and that began with Kim. Kim, at this time, was one part of a triangular relationship between himself, Mao, and Stalin. Each of them, in an interesting way, relied on each other but also were working against each other in unique ways. Kim needed both Stalin and Mao for support, but could always play them off each other if they weren't satisfying his desires. Mao could use Kim against Stalin as a bargaining tool and didn't really need Stalin's support, but understood that Stalin's words still carried a great deal of weight. Stalin understood that the Soviets needed as many friendly regimes along its borders as it could get, and that Mao, as the leader of the largest communist state, could leave him behind if he thought it worthwhile to pursue a relationship with the United States. Each needed the others, and because they were never in the same room with each other, their separate conversations about each other were often exaggerated or ignored when conveyed to the other. That was just the nature of a three-person relationship built around bilateral conversations in a time when rapid communication and travel was not always that quick. As I mentioned last week, Soviet shipments of arms, ammunition, and other military equipment necessary for an invasion began arriving in North Korea before the final decision to make war was even made. Once Stalin told Kim that he needed Mao's approval, Stalin approved new weapons shipments. These shipments had arrived in Korea just as Kim was returning from Beijing in May and were immediately spread among the Korean People's Army, especially those units on the 38th parallel. The monetary value of Soviet military assistance nearly quadrupled between 1949 and 1950. But given that the war started halfway through the year, I think it's safe to say that the amount provided to the DPRK in the first half of 1950 was, at a minimum, equal in value to all Soviet military assistance given in the whole of 1949. Later shipments in the year would make up the remainder, as the Koreans would need to cover their losses. A few helpful advisors arrived alongside the weapons shipments: 3 Soviet major generals, Vasiliev, Postnikov, and Marchenko, along with their staffs. In May 1950, these generals rewrote the North Korean battle plan. According to the head of the KPA's Operations Directorate, the previous battle plan was defensive and had poor coordination between different branches of the army. The new rewritten plan was for a counterattack. It was written in under a week and did not include any analysis of the terrain KPA forces would face south of the parallel. In spite of its title, Preemptive Strike Operations Plan, and the alleged inclusion of steps to conceal DPRK troop movements from the Republic of Korea Army, it was always referred to internally as a plan for counterattack. And even though this plan was written by the Soviets, it would still require Chinese assistance. This is partially because of the equipment requirements of the battle plan, but mostly because Kim did not want to haggle with Stalin any more than he had to for equipment, and thought Mao an easier target. When KPA Chief of Staff Kim Kwang-hyup went to Beijing in January of 1950, he had just 2 questions to ask the Chinese. Could they spare the Koreans serving in the People's Liberation Army? And if they could spare those men, could they also spare their arms and ammunition? Turns out the answer to both questions were yes, as Mao gave the order on January 22nd to send the men back to Korea wearing Korean uniforms. The DPRK's explanation to the Korean people was that these men were simply KPA soldiers who were training in China, not ethnic Koreans who had lived much of their lives in China and had probably never stepped foot in their ethnic homeland before 1950. This gifting of former Red Army troops to the KPA when considered with Mao's later conversations about the invasion with Kim, show that Mao had to know a war in Korea was coming. But, through an active effort by the North Korean leadership to freeze out the Chinese from the planning process, he did not know when the initial invasion would take place. Part of this was because of the race between the Chinese and the Koreans to begin their invasion before the other. The other half of this is that Kim did not trust the Chinese to undercut his efforts in some other way. That is why Soviet arms shipments traveled by sea and not by rail through Manchuria, and that is why high-ranking military leaders from the Yan'an faction were iced out of military preparations. This is just the first crack between factions in the DPRK leadership. Many more will widen as the weight of the war presses harder on Kim Il-sung. In the months leading up to the invasion on June 25th, the Korean People's Army grew with 3 new divisions. These divisions were made up of the men released from service within the Chinese Red Army and transferred to the KPA as they were mostly Korean divisions anyway. This was not a small victory for Kim. It added 15,000 to 25,000 soldiers to the KPA in the critical months before the invasion and brought the North roughly even in terms of manpower with the South, who we will discuss in the next episode. These men were also battle-hardened from their time serving in the Chinese Civil War. Accurate numbers have never been released about the strength of the Northern forces in the lead up to the war, but some educated guesses have been made that place Northern numbers between 80,000 at the low end and 100,000 at the high end. This is not including internal police forces that are sometimes included in the total number of soldiers. Quoting from Bruce Cummings' Volume 2 of The Origins of the Korean War about the disposition of Northern forces as of June 24th, 5,700 troops were at Changdan, 3,300 at Haeju, 2,000 at Sarawan, 2,200 near Kumchan, 11,000 near Kunwa, and 5,700 near Yangyang, totaling about 30,000 near the 38th parallel. A map of these places can be found on our social media channels and the website. A further 50,000 were spread throughout the rest of the country, showing that, despite the imminent invasion, the bulk of troops were not shifted to the soon-to-be front lines. Cummings' own estimate gives the KPA 80,000 troops throughout the country, just barely leaning towards the 38th parallel in terms of geographic placement. Roy Appleman, in his official history of the first 5 months of the conflict for the United States Army, estimates that the KPA had 8 full divisions and 2 half-strength divisions for a total of 99,000 soldiers. Quoting again from Cummings, quote, "This evidence is complex and somewhat contradictory, but it suggests that, as of June 25th, the KPA numbered not less than 87,500 and not more than 99,000, that about 1/3 was acquired in 1950 from former Chinese Red Army returnees, and that this buildup only brought the KPA to the levels reached by the Southern forces the previous summer." End quote. Now, we'll talk more about the Army of the Republic of Korea next episode, but in short, the ROKA had at least 90,000 troops, with just over 30,000 on the border, 35,000 within a day's march of the border, and the remainder spread out throughout the rest of the country. That tracks with the population density of the country, so I don't believe it's indicative of any imminent desire by the South to cross the parallel on its own. In total, the KPA was also well equipped with Soviet equipment, like 175 warplanes, 1,600 artillery pieces, and 250 T-34 tanks, the tank that played an instrumental factor in the Soviet defeat of the Germans on the Eastern Front of World War II. The South only outnumbered the North in naval vessels, but neither naval force would play a meaningful role in the coming conflict. Warplanes, artillery, and tanks were significantly more important, and the Korean People's Army had the advantage in each of those departments on the eve of the war. Before it kicked off, the war plan was for a quick indecisive drive down the peninsula, lasting no longer than 1 month. The main part of the war was expected to be over within the first few days, after the capture of Seoul. The rest of the month was essentially pushing down to the southern coast and pushing off reactionary forces from the peninsula. No contingency plans were made in the event of failure, which seems like an oversight. The thought behind this was that if Seoul fell, Syngman Rhee would surrender, the Republic would collapse shortly thereafter, the Americans would then see no reason to intervene on behalf of a defeated ally, and everything would be hunky-dory for the Communists in no time at all. As we now know, this is not what happened, but we'll get to that soon. Although the Soviets and Chinese had given their blessing for the invasion, they did not have direct input on the timing of the attack. They had to know it would be sooner rather than later. June 25th was not a particularly special date before 1950, though. There is no deeper meaning that should be taken from that Sunday. That's why, when we ask why the Korean War started when it did, it's important to understand everything we've talked about over the last couple weeks. In terms of historical narrative, it is not a simple rising action, climax, falling action. Altogether, it is a fractal, centered at the 30th parallel on June 25th, drawing in different people and different ideas and different movements towards an explosive convergence. For the North and South separately, it is a slow, historical spiral towards a seemingly inevitable war. At 3 in the morning on June 25th, Kim Il-sung's closest advisors met in Pyongyang. Their great leader spoke of a southern attack all along the border and asked for a northern counterattack. Matters of war and peace were still left to the agreement of the cabinet, no matter the level of control Kim exercised elsewhere. All in attendance agreed to Kim's plan, and 1 hour later, the Korean War began. And that's where we'll leave our discussion for now, but not for long. On Thursday, we will see how things are going south of the 38th parallel in Ready Player 2. Next week, our fractal will converge as the Korean War begins on June 25th, 1950. If you're on social media, you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook as @CTCA Podcast. If you are not on social media, or if you just want to look around, you can find more information, including the references for today's episode, at ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. That's ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. We release new episodes every Tuesday, and sometimes Thursdays. Please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating wherever you listen to podcasts. I am Trevor Owens, and this is Coming Together, Coming Apart. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have an enjoyable week.